Donald Trump and his corrupt Department of Justice are quietly surrendering right now in what might be the most humiliating legal defeat of his entire administration. And what makes this even more pathetic is that they're trying to do it secretly. They're trying to bury this story. They're trying to pretend like nothing happened, but we caught them. We see exactly what they're doing. And I'm going to expose the entire thing right here, right now, because Trump's so-called interim United States attorneys are getting fired left and right by federal courts, and Trump is too embarrassed to admit it publicly. This is massive. This is Trump's Department of Justice completely collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and incompetence. And the people Trump personally handpicked to go after his political enemies, they're being disqualified. They're being evicted from their offices. They're being told by federal judges, you have no authority. You were never legitimate. Get out. And Trump is quietly backing down because he knows he lost. I'm going to walk you through exactly what's happening, who's getting fired, and why this is such a devastating blow to Trump's entire revenge agenda. But real quick, before we get into this, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built National Brief Network to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, please subscribe to our channel, because you might think you are but aren't. Your subscription actually matters here. All right, let's get into this. So here's what's actually happening right now. Trump tried to install what he called interim United States attorneys all across the country. These were people who were not confirmed by the Senate. These were people who Trump just appointed without going through the proper legal process. And why did Trump do this? Because he wanted people who would be loyal to him personally. He wanted people who would go after his political enemies. He wanted people who would prosecute New York Attorney General Letitia James. He wanted people who would prosecute his critics. He wanted people who would turn the Department of Justice into his personal law firm. But here's the problem. There's a law that governs how interim United States attorneys can be appointed, and Trump violated that law. Trump's Department of Justice tried to just ignore the law and install these fake interim attorneys anyway. But federal courts across the country looked at what Trump was doing and said, no, this is illegal. These appointments are unlawful. These people have no authority. And now, one by one, Trump's handpicked attorneys are being disqualified and removed from office. Let me give you the specifics because this is where it gets really damning. Let's start with Lindsay Halligan. Who is Lindsay Halligan? Well, she's a former insurance attorney and beauty pageant contestant who somehow worked her way into Trump's inner circle. She had never worked in a federal prosecutor's office in her entire life. She had no experience prosecuting federal crimes. She didn't work at any prestigious law firm. She didn't have any notable cases. She was just, by all accounts, someone who was not particularly distinguished as a lawyer. But Trump picked her anyway. Why? Because she was loyal. Because Trump thought she would do his bidding. And Trump installed her as the interim United States attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. That's one of the biggest federal districts in the entire country. That's where major national security cases are prosecuted. That's where defense fraud cases are prosecuted. That's where some of the most important federal prosecutions in America happen. And Trump put someone with zero federal prosecution experience in charge. Now, here's where it gets even worse. Lindsay Halligan wasn't just unqualified. She was corrupt. She was installed specifically to go after Trump's political enemies, including New York Attorney General Letitia James. And the way she went about trying to prosecute James was so incompetent and so unethical that it's actually stunning. Let me walk you through what Halligan did, because this is important. First, Halligan put a tainted witness in front of a grand jury. This was a witness who had seen attorney-client privileged information that they should never have had access to. That is a massive ethical violation. That is the kind of thing that can get a lawyer disbarred. Second, Halligan provided fake legal instructions to the grand jury. She gave them incorrect information about the law. She misled them about what they were supposed to be considering. That is prosecutorial misconduct. That is the kind of thing that can get cases thrown out and prosecutors sanctioned. Third, and this is perhaps the most egregious thing, Halligan submitted an indictment as though it was the official true bill that the full grand jury had voted on. But here's the problem. The full grand jury never even saw that indictment. She submitted an indictment that the grand jury never approved. Think about what that means. That means Halligan was trying to prosecute someone based on an indictment that wasn't real. That is fraud on the court. That is one of the most serious violations a prosecutor can commit. And Halligan did all of this while she was supposedly serving as the interim United States attorney. But then federal courts looked at her appointment and said, wait a minute, this appointment is illegal. Here's why. Under federal law, you can only appoint one interim United States attorney per district. Virginia already had an interim attorney. So when Trump tried to install Halligan as a second interim attorney, court said, that's not how the law works. You only get one shot. You already used your one interim appointment. This second appointment is unlawful. And just like that, Halligan was disqualified. She lost her authority. She was told she had to stop acting as United States attorney. And honestly, that was probably good fortune for her, because if she hadn't been disqualified on that technical ground, courts were going to start ruling on all of her unethical conduct. Courts were going to start sanctioning her for all the misconduct she committed. But she got disqualified first, so she avoided having to answer for all of that. But here's where Trump's surrender gets really interesting. After Halligan was disqualified, you know what Trump and Pam Bondi did? They submitted her name to the Senate for formal confirmation. Let that sink in for a moment. This woman who was just ruled to be an unlawful interim attorney, this woman who committed multiple ethical violations, this woman who has zero federal prosecution experience. Trump and Bondi said, we think the Senate should confirm her as the permanent United States attorney. That is absurd. That is Trump giving the biggest middle finger to the justice system. That is Trump saying, I don't care what the courts say. I don't care what the law says. I'm going to do whatever I want. But here's the thing. It's not going to work. Lindsey Halligan is not going to be confirmed by the Senate. She's not going to get through what's called the blue slip process. In Virginia, there are two Democratic senators, Tim Kaine and Mark Warner. And under Senate rules, both senators from a state get to submit what's called a blue slip for any judicial or prosecutorial nominee from their state. If they don't submit the blue slip, the nomination doesn't move forward. And there is zero chance that Kaine and Warner are going to submit blue slips for Lindsey Halligan. Zero chance, so Trump submitted her name knowing she won't be confirmed. Why would he do that? Probably so he can whine about it. Probably so he can say, oh, look how unfair the Democrats are. They won't confirm my nominee. But the reality is, Trump's nominee is unqualified and corrupt. That's why she's not getting confirmed. Now, Lindsey Halligan is not the only one. Let's talk about Alina Habba. Yes, that Alina Habba. Trump's personal lawyer who has lost case after case after case for him. Trump tried to install her as the interim United States attorney for New Jersey. And just like with Halligan, courts looked at her appointment and said, this is illegal. She was not lawfully appointed. She has no authority. So Alina Habba was disqualified too. But here's where it gets even more embarrassing for Trump. After Habba was disqualified, she refused to leave. She kept showing up to the office. She kept trying to act as though she still had authority. So the Third Circuit Court of Appeals had to issue what was essentially an eviction order. They had to tell her, when we said you were disqualified, we meant you need to get out. Leave. You're done. And you know what Trump's DOJ argued? They argued that disqualified doesn't necessarily mean she has to leave the position. Can you believe that? They tried to argue that being disqualified doesn't mean you have to stop doing the job. And the courts had to basically say, yes, that's exactly what disqualified means. It means you have no authority. It means you're not the United States attorney. It means you need to leave. That's the level of absurdity we're dealing with here. That's how far Trump and his DOJ are willing to go to defy court orders and ignore the law. But it's not working. The courts are standing firm. And Trump is being forced to surrender. Now, here's what makes this surrender so quiet and so humiliating for Trump. Trump hasn't held a press conference to announce that his interim attorneys are being removed. Trump hasn't tweeted about it. Trump hasn't acknowledged it publicly at all. Instead, Trump's DOJ is just quietly submitting these names to the Senate for confirmation, hoping that nobody notices what they're doing. They're hoping that the story doesn't get much attention. They're hoping they can just move on and pretend like this whole illegal appointment scheme never happened. But we're not going to let them do that. We're going to make sure people understand what actually happened here. Trump tried to install fake interim United States attorneys who were not lawfully appointed. He did this so he could use the Department of Justice as his personal weapon against his political enemies. But federal courts across the country said no. Courts disqualified these fake attorneys. Courts ordered them to leave their positions. And now Trump is being forced to go through the actual legal process of nominating people and getting them confirmed by the Senate. That is a surrender. That is Trump backing down. That is Trump being forced to follow the law after trying to ignore it. And here's why this matters so much. If Trump had been allowed to install these fake interim attorneys, every single case they touched would have been illegitimate. Every indictment they brought, every prosecution they oversaw, every conviction they obtained, all of it would have been subject to being thrown out because the attorney who brought the charges had no legal authority to do so. Think about what that means for public safety. Think about what that means for justice. If you prosecute someone for a serious crime, and then it turns out the prosecutor who brought the charges wasn't legally appointed, that defendant can argue that the entire prosecution is invalid. That defendant can potentially go free even if they're guilty. That's the mess Trump created. That's the chaos Trump unleashed. And that's why federal courts stepped in and said, this has to stop. These appointments are illegal. These people need to be removed. And now Trump is being forced to do things the right way. He has to nominate people. He has to submit them to the Senate. He has to go through the confirmation process. He has to follow the law. Now, let me be really clear about something. There are plenty of qualified attorneys out there who could serve as United States attorneys. There are attorneys with decades of federal prosecution experience. There are attorneys who have worked their way up through the ranks of the Department of Justice. There are attorneys who have demonstrated professionalism and competence and a commitment to prosecuting cases without fear or favor. But Trump doesn't want those people. Trump wants loyalists. Trump wants people who will do his political bidding. Trump wants people like Lindsey Halligan and Alina Habba who have no real prosecutorial experience, but who Trump thinks will be loyal to him personally. And that is the corruption of the Department of Justice that we're witnessing right now. That is Trump turning the DOJ into his personal law firm. That is Trump trying to weaponize federal prosecutions against his political enemies. But the courts are pushing back. The courts are saying no. The courts are enforcing the law, and Trump is being forced to surrender. Now, here's what you need to understand about how United States attorneys are supposed to be appointed. There's a process. There's a reason the process exists. When a president wants to appoint a United States attorney, they nominate someone. That person's name goes to the Senate. The Senate Judiciary Committee holds hearings. They examine the nominee's qualifications. They look at the nominee's experience. They ask questions about the nominee's background and their approach to prosecution. And then, if the nominee from a particular state, the two senators from that state get to weigh in through the blue slip process. This gives senators a chance to say, this person is from our state. We have concerns about their qualifications. Or they can say, this person is qualified. We support them. And then the full Senate votes on whether to confirm the nominee. That's the constitutional process. That's how it's supposed to work. But Trump tried to skip all of that. Trump tried to just install people without going through confirmation. Trump tried to bypass the Senate. Trump tried to ignore the Constitution. And the courts said no. The courts enforced the law. And now Trump is being forced to follow the actual process. And here's the thing. When Trump actually has to put these nominees through the confirmation process, a lot of them are not going to make it. Lindsey Halligan is not going to be confirmed. There's no way the Senate is going to look at her record, look at her lack of experience, look at her ethical violations and say, yes, this person should be a United States attorney. The same is true for many of Trump's other picks. When they actually have to go through Senate scrutiny, when they actually have to answer questions under oath about their qualifications, a lot of them are going to fail. And that's why Trump tried to skip the process in the first place. Trump knew that his hand-picked loyalists wouldn't survive Senate confirmation, so he tried to just install them as interim attorneys and hope that nobody would challenge it. But people did challenge it. Courts did step in, and now Trump's entire scheme is falling apart. One by one, his fake interim attorneys are being disqualified. One by one, they're being removed from office, and Trump is being forced to go back to square one and do things the legal way. That is a surrender. That is a defeat. And Trump is trying to keep it quiet because he's embarrassed. He's embarrassed that his plan failed. He's embarrassed that the court shut him down. He's embarrassed that his handpicked loyalists turned out to be so incompetent that they couldn't even hold on to their positions long enough to do his dirty work. So Trump is quietly backing down. Trump is quietly submitting names to the Senate. Trump is quietly pretending like he was always planning to go through the proper process, but we know the truth. We know Trump tried to violate the law. We know he tried to install fake interim attorneys. We know the court stopped him, and we know he's now surrendering. Make sure you're subscribed to National Brief Network because we're going to keep tracking this story as it develops. We're going to keep watching to see which of Trump's nominees actually make it through Senate confirmation. We're going to keep exposing the corruption and incompetence of Trump's Department of Justice because this is the story that matters. This is the story about whether the rule of law still means something in America. This is the story about whether courts can still check presidential power. This is the story about whether Trump can turn the Department of Justice into his personal weapon or whether our institutions will push back. And right now, the institutions are pushing back. The courts are standing firm, and Trump is surrendering. Share this video with everyone you know because people need to understand what's happening. Trump is quietly backing down. His fake attorneys are getting fired, and the rule of law is being enforced. This story is far from over. Stay tuned.